het wyd gesmeer. Die lied van 'n volk se ontwaking, wat harte laat sidder en bewe.
Ek smoeg vir die vrese waarmee ons moet lewe, vir guns en vir moord en vir ryp. Ek smoeg vir die bad news, vir Zuma en sy views, waarna ons op TV moet kyk. Ek wil nie meer hoor hoe ons tieners begrawe, oor niemand hul steur aan die wet. Ek wil nie meer lees van affirmative action of beklei om te hou wat ek het. Gee vir my 'n nuwe gei, 'n Koos Du Plessis en 'n tellery, wat liedjies sing en skryf en stry oor die mooi van ons land en ons reg om hier te kan bly. Ek siek vir Malema, sy leuns en sy sê maar, ons hou maar ons mond en betaal. Ons kruip weg in kampe, word blind vir die rampe en bid dat die Heer ons omhaal. Daar's Winnie Mandela wat mense verbrand het, maar nou wil sy huil in haar hand. Die staatskas is leeg en die ANC jeug saai verwoesting en pyn deur ons land. Gee vir my 'n nuwe gei, 'n Koos Du Plessis en 'n tellery, wat liedjies sing en skryf en stry oor die mooi van ons land en ons reg om hier te kan bly. Se bloed het betaal vir die grond waar sy kinders se kinders kan bly. Maar sy huis en sy lande is nou in die hande van die vyand teen wie hy moes stry. Ons kinders verstaan nie waar kom al vandaan nie, hul erfenis is uitgewis. Geen volkslied of vlag nie en geen erewag nie vir die helde wat daar nie meer is. Gee vir my 'n nuwe gei, 'n Koos Du Plessis en 'n tellery, wat liedjies sing en skryf en stry oor die mooi van ons land en ons reg om hier te kan bly. Gee vir my 'n nuwe gei, 'n Koos Du Plessis en 'n tellery, wat liedjies sing en skryf en stry oor die mooi van ons land en ons reg om hier te kan bly. En ons reg om hier te kan bly.
Welcome to Radio Free South Africa, broadcasting on Reach Out America by World Integrity News Network. Our call-in number is 347-850-1243. This is your host, Karin Smith. We've spoken about the true history of South Africa, and today I bring you Schalk van der Merwe, a lawyer, for which we forgive him, who is more than qualified to talk about the affirmative action laws in South Africa and their effect on the white minority population. There are more than 100 race-based laws protecting the majority from the 8% white minority and effectively excluding all whites from the job market. Schalk worked for the South African National Prosecution Authority for many years. Thereafter, he became involved in labor law and worked for an employers organization. He later founded his own labor and business consultancy. He also presided over many hundreds of labor mediations, conciliations, and arbitrations for the South African Commission for Conciliation, Mediation, and Arbitration. that you go to if you have been fired unfairly or if you think you have been treated unfairly by an employer. So for this reason, Schalk is eminently qualified to talk about the effects of BBBEE on whites and, in fact, on the general South African population. Welcome, Schalk.
Good evening, Karin. Good evening, listeners, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
It's an absolute pleasure, Schalk, and thank you very much for being willing to speak about this. What I'd like you to discuss before we go anywhere is the powerhouse that South Africa was economically, politically, educationally, in medicine, etc., before 1994, when we handed over the country to the ANC. Because people need to have a picture of where we came from before we can tell them where we are at now.
Sure, Karin. Yeah, you're quite correct when you say that South Africa was a powerhouse. South Africa, many American listeners sometimes have difficulty putting this into their mind's eye. South Africa is a very small country at the southern tip of Africa. It was colonized by the Dutch people in 1652. Through the years, it developed as a colony. During the early 1800s, it was taken over by the British. I'm not going to go through the whole history leading up to 1994 and the clashes between the British Empire and the Boer republics. But the long and the short is, it was basically a white country with black areas where black people lived. Basically the same as in the United States, where you had a white settlement and the black reservations. You must also remember that through the long history of our South Africa, there's always been clashes between the different white groups and later on the white group and the black groups. So it's a history of conflict, but it's also a history of huge growth. And the most part of that growth actually came under the apartheid era. Now, even previously, before the apartheid era, which effectively came to power only in 1948, you had a British colonial system in the economics that was actually also segregationist towards the black people in South Africa. So apartheid wasn't a new thing when it was labeled as such by the Nationalist Party who came to power in 1948. However, from 1948 onwards, until the dawn of the so-called New South Africa, we saw a huge, tremendous growth in the economy of South Africa, in its military, in its political might, so that South Africa became, not only on the African continent, but also the whole southern hemisphere, it became this huge powerhouse. Just to give you an indication, at one point in time, South Africa was producing more than 80% of the total manufactured goods in Africa. Now imagine the small country on the northern American continent. If you can imagine that, basically Central America versus the rest of Africa, the whole rest of the northern American continent. And then Central America is producing 80% of all the manufactured goods, to give you an idea of what I'm speaking about. The production of electricity. We built up a company, EFCOM. It was originally called EFCOM, EVKOM. Later on it became ESCOM, and that was a power utility. And that power utility at one point in time produced more than 90% of all the electricity on the African continent. So it's a huge powerhouse that was literally sitting at the tip of Africa. Just a moment. I can also describe to you the military might of South Africa. The South African Defence Force was, during the apartheid years, the strongest defence force in the Southern Hemisphere. We built our own weapons. We had the capability of building guns, more specifically the G5 and G6 cannon that was leading in the world. The technology of the G5 and G6 was later on used by the Americans to build their howitzers. So that just simply indicates to you how advanced the technology was that South Africa was producing. At the later stages of apartheid, we were even at the point where we were building the nuclear bomb, which would basically have made us the only nuclear power on the African continent, building our own nuclear bombs. So South Africa was a hugely developed country at the time of the dawn of the new South Africa.
We produced just about everything, didn't we? And we exported hundreds of thousands of tons of fruit, vegetables, food to the rest of the world.
Yes, indeed. You must remember that South Africa, because it was colonized by the white peoples of Europe, they brought the farming technology of Europe to Africa. So South Africa became a bread basket of Africa. It was producing a huge amount of farm goods, of foods, milk, meat, anything that you can imagine. It was produced in South Africa. It was produced in such quantities that we couldn't use everything that we were producing. We were exporting. We were a food exporting country during the apartheid years. You must also remember something. South Africa is a very dry country. So the farmers utilized all their skills, and they became extremely skilled to work the land, to work with the water that was available, to actually start producing in high numbers. Now, the moment that you moved north of the border, out of South Africa into Africa itself, the rest of Africa, you didn't find commercial farming. You find subsistence farming, where people simply farm to feed themselves and maybe their extended family. So it's a totally different setup from what was in South Africa.
And during the war in Rhodesia, we were helping them with petrol, with food, with all kinds of things. I mean, we were essentially helping all the countries around us. Rhodesia, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Angola, all of those countries. We had a good relationship with during the apartheid years, before everybody was decolonized. We were all working together and helping each other.
Yes, that's a fact. Just for you American listeners, maybe what we remember as Rhodesia, it's called Zimbabwe today. It was part of the British Empire, and then after the extraction of the British Empire from Africa, it became an independent country. I'm not going to go into the history of Zimbabwe, Rhodesia now, but the long and short is that at the stage that the white population, with support of the majority of the black population, declared themselves independent from Britain. It was called the UDI, the Unilateral Declaration of Independence. And for some time, Rhodesia was then ruled also as a white country in Africa. Then, of course, the communists basically took over the country. There was a civil war, and they took over the country, and it became Zimbabwe. That is still called today, and it's governed by the same person and the same party, the ZANU-PF. And the man governing the country is Mr. Robert Mugabe, the very well-known Mr. Mugabe. And he's been ruling that country literally since he took it over from white decades ago. So he's basically a dictator.
Absolutely, and I think that's very important to know when you're talking about South Africa, because what Zimbabwe is today is where South Africa is heading very fast. But to get South Africa and Zimbabwe together were the bread baskets of Africa, and in a big way of the rest of the world as well, because both those countries were thriving under white rule. Their farmers were, as you said previously, they had so much food they had to export because there was absolutely no way that the country could use the amount of food produced by them. So then came our 1994 and the Rainbow Nation. And we haven't even talked about the medical advancements and all of those things that South Africa had. But in general, South Africa was a first world country, clean, relatively crime-free until the freedom struggle started. And people had a good life, black and white.
Karin, that's a fact. Just coming back a little bit to for instance, the medical technology that we had. Your listeners may be reminded of Dr. Chris Barnard, who actually did the first heart plant on Earth. That was done in South Africa by a South African. It was done in a state hospital. Now, if you go into a state hospital today, sometimes you won't even find medicine. Never mind a doctor so skilled that he can actually do this revolutionary type of surgery, of transplanting a heart. That just indicates to you the level of advancement. And you're quite right in saying South Africa was a first world country. It was a leading country of the West. It was seen as one of the bulwarks against communism in the world. The CIA and the Americans spent huge amount of money and time bolstering South Africa, actually supporting South Africa behind the scenes, but it was seen as the bulwark against communism, as for instance, you would have seen Japan as a bulwark against communism in the East.
Yes, absolutely. And then came the struggle years, which, in my opinion, it really started in 76 with the Soweto riots, but we did have problems before then. But I think that was when the world started turning against us with the apartheid thing because of that iconic and well-known picture of the black guy who was killed by the police during the Soweto riots.
Yes, that's a fact. Those riots purported to be riots against the use of Afrikaans in black schools. Whereas the real reasons were quite different. It was simply a mass uprising of students after a long time of resentment and people going and disturbing them. And it was basically a planned riot. It was never so much against the Afrikaans language, the use of the Afrikaans language, but that became the signature. That became the picture of what the world believed apartheid to have been. Now, the long and the short is, we can never, I'm not going to apologize for apartheid, but we can never deny that apartheid was a harsh system in terms of there was racial segregation. People were living, one part of the population was living in one part of the country, the other in another. But apartheid was portrayed as this evil. It was even compared to Nazi Germany. The rumors that were spread that we were killing in South Africa millions of black people. It was basically portrayed as the most evil system that there is. So much so that the United Nations actually declared apartheid a crime against humanity. But if you look at what happened actually during apartheid, you saw that it was a huge outflow of white capital, where the white businesses and white people paying taxes, they were actually sponsoring the development of the Bantustans. Those were the areas where the black people lived, and in general advancing black people. So it's not the system of exploitation that we are made to believe what apartheid was, and that's a very unfortunate thing. Then you must also remember that initially it was quite peaceful. The resentment against apartheid was quite peaceful. But then as from the 1960s and specifically from the 1970s, it became more violent. It basically became, in certain areas, a civil war against the South African government. Now, any government on earth facing a civil war from some of its citizens will respond to that. Unfortunately, we lost the media war because what the media on the outside were portraying was a white government oppressing black people, whereas it was simply a government responding to terrorism and uprising within its own borders. So that's unfortunately what we ended up with.
I absolutely agree with you, Schalk, because if you look at the iconic icon of peace, Nelson Mandela, in the world's eyes today, and the picture that we have of him in South Africa, there is no similarity. There is absolutely no similarity between what the world believes him to have been and what South Africans believe him to have been.
Yes, that's definitely. Some people have this opinion of Mr. Mandela, and I will give him the due that is due to him. There could have been a civil war at the dawn of the new South Africa, so maybe he was instrumental of at least stopping that. So, but in many people's mind, Mr. Nelson Mandela is an icon. He's like an angel. But they forget that he was sitting in prison for real, actual crimes. It's portrayed these days as being a political prisoner. Yes, maybe there was an element of political maneuvering at the point in time against him. But the court case that was run was an actual criminal court case, like you would have in any other criminal matter. There was very big chance of him being found not guilty, and it was proven by the state, the terrorism charges, etc. It was proven against him on, like in any other court of law, beyond reasonable doubt, and he was sent to prison by a court of law. Now, these days it's portrayed as Mr. Mandela being caught, and because he was against the government, he was put in prison for 27 years. That's simply not the case. That's simply not the case. That is not what happened.
No, because even Amnesty International, which is a very liberal group of people, they refused to defend him when his court case was going on because they said he was a terrorist. And in any country, African country, he probably wouldn't even have got a trial because of what he had done and what was found that the limpet mines and the hand grenades, etc., that were found, during and after the trial. So essentially, any country convicting somebody of treasonous acts, the penalty is death, and we still had the death penalty in South Africa, but we did not do that.
What you're touching now is absolutely the truth. If you look at similar regimes at the time of when Mr. Mandela was found guilty and sent to prison, similar regimes in Africa, it was basically dictatorships. It was people like Mobutu Sese Seko and everything that went on in Uganda at that stage. Did
we not have Idi Amin at that same time?
Yes. He was the dictator of Uganda, and even before him, the president he took over from, he himself was a dictator. So it's quite right to say that in South Africa you had a fair legal process, through which Mr. Mandela was found guilty and sent to prison, whereas in any other African country he would have been seen as a dissident and maybe shot in the street. It's as simple as that. And yes, I agree about the death penalty. If the South African government was simply taking out opponents, what would have been more easy than simply to have ordered the judge to make the decision of him being hanged, and simply take him out as an opponent. But it didn't happen. A court of law listened to mitigational circumstances, and they found that although he was found guilty of high treason, he would not be hanged. He would be sent to prison for the rest of his life, which was a reduced sentence from of course, the death penalty.
Him and the others with him. I mean, there were many others. Zuma was also convicted, and Joe Slovo, and many others. But we did not hand out the death penalty, as you said, willy-nilly, because nothing would have been easier than that to get rid of the opposition. But we did not do that. So the world needs to pay attention to the fact that he had a fair trial. Amnesty International didn't want to defend him at the time. The ANC was a terrorist organization until very early in the 2000s in America itself.
Yes, the ANC was declared, it was on the list of terrorist organizations in the United States. Mr. Mandela himself was listed as a terrorist. And of course, once again, let's use the word willy-nilly that you just used. The US won't go willy-nilly and go and declare an organization being terrorist if it was not at that point in time. We must also remember something else. Apartheid South Africa is portrayed as a one-party Nazi-style dictatorship. Now, that was never the case. Inside South Africa, even from 1948, when the Nationalist Party took over, South Africa was still a democratic, open society. You had the nationalist government running the government, being voted in by the majority of the white voters in South Africa. It was every 5 years there was an election. There were opposition parties. The party that is today called the DA, the Democratic Alliance, stemmed from that time. Mrs. Helen Suzman. I'm sure some of you American listeners will remember Mrs. Helen Suzman, a leading liberal Jewish woman, which indicated there was not even an element of anti-Semitism in South Africa. A Jewish woman actually led for many years the opposition in Parliament, where she grilled the Nationalist Party for certain laws, certain actions, all these things. So it was a democratic society in which all these things took place. And then you must remember that the so-called white South Africa, in other words, that's where the National Party directly ruled, that was opposed to the Bantustans. Now, the Bantustans were the areas where the black people lived. It was demarcated. It was actually later on enlarged to house the black people in South Africa. And gradually, they became self-reliant. They were given self-determination. The new word, the modern word for it is self-determination. It was called self-rule at that point in time. And later on, some of these Bantustans even became independent countries. Transkei being one of the best examples of that. It was an independent country. Now, here's a point that people don't always take into their minds. When the British left South Africa, Southern Africa, you had, for instance, Bechuana land, which is today called Botswana. You had Swaziland, you had Basotho land, that's today called Lesotho. So it was okay for the British to create Bantustans and give them self-rule. But for some reason, the same standard didn't apply to the South African government. For some reason, it was wrong for the South African government to also create Bantustans and make them independent nations.
Which they had inherited. They inherited that system. They did not invent it.
Exactly. If you look at the British colonial expansion in South Africa, you will find that the British were taking over the black areas, not the Boer people, not the Afrikaner people of later years. It was the British people. When the Great Trek took place in the 1830s. And now we're back in the history of South Africa, and I love history.
Me too.
You put me on the wrong track now, but let's speak about that. When the Great Trek took place, the white colonists reached the Fish River and the Kai River in the Eastern Cape. Beyond that was black land. We didn't go into the black lands. We didn't go into the areas that the Xhosa people and the Tembu people were living in. We moved away. We packed our wagons and we moved into the interior of South Africa where nobody was living. The British were the people that then went border war, and actually in the end they took over what later became Ciskei and Transkei. They took over those black areas.
Because essentially, Schalk, as I understand things, and I really am a history buff, the Boers never wanted to rule over anybody. They did not want to be politicians, etc. They just wanted a place they could call their own.
That's a fact. Now we're even moving back in history from the 1830s. You would find that even by the late 1600s, that's so typical about the Afrikaner people, the Boer people. We're always dissatisfied with our governments, always. So even by the 1680s, the Vryburgers, the free citizens living in the Cape, they even became upset with the Dutch colonial government. And they said, we want our own farms. And later on, they started to move into the interior themselves. They were called trekboere. Trek simply meaning moving, going, not staying resident at one place. So even at that stage, we were moving away from government to be independent, to be free, not to rule anybody. By the time of the Great Trek, it was the British government that then ruled the subcontinent. And the Boer people, they became very dissatisfied with a host of things. Now, I'm not going to go into the reasons for the Great Trek. But then they packed up their wagons, they packed up their households, their homesteads, whatever they had, their farm animals, and they moved away. They didn't want war. They didn't want to fight the British. They didn't want to fight the Xhosa people. They moved away. Now imagine yourself, Karin, sitting in your house, being so dissatisfied that tomorrow morning you pack up all your stuff into your truck and you move away 1,000 kilometers just to have peace. that is the situation of the poor people. That is why they moved away.
Well, I just want to say here, Schalk, that is exactly the situation of the poor people today. They're either moving away or still staying and trying to get a piece of land for themselves where they can live their way, speak their language, and have their faith. It hasn't changed, has it?
It hasn't changed. It hasn't changed. You will see in South African history that by the late 1800s, now at that point in time, the Great Trek already took place now 60 years. Before that, in the meantime, Boer republics were established. They were actually modern-run states. For instance, the Orange Free State, the Republic of the Orange Free State, won international awards in Europe for their education. I don't know if you were even aware of that. So it was modern democratic societies created by the Boer people to simply rule themselves. They didn't want to pick a fight with anybody. And once again, the British Empire, diamonds were discovered in the western part of the Orange Free State. They nearly went to war with the Orange Free State. In the end, the Orange Free State actually gave them the Campbell grounds and the areas where the diamonds were, just to keep peace, just to say to the British government, take your diamonds, but please don't make war on us. We don't want war. We simply want to live in peace. In Transvaal, in the Witwatersrand, gold was discovered. That became the reason why the Anglo-Boer War in 1899 came to being. It's the simple reason why that happened, because the British Empire wanted the gold of Transvaal. Once again, it's exactly what you're saying. Even today we have it. Apartheid then came. The Afrikaner nationalist government took over, and for some time the Afrikaners ruled themselves in South Africa peacefully. We didn't go and make war against everybody. We didn't go over the border into Botswana and try to occupy them and take them over. When the Portuguese colonies had civil wars, we didn't go in there and occupy and exploited them. We actually simply helped those colonists that came over the border and warehoused them. And once again today, I think you're quite right in summarizing it, that the Afrikaner people, the white people now, they don't want war. They don't want to be in anybody's way and be obtrusive. They're actually trying to work the things out, trying to assist everybody, but they kept on being beaten up. And that is why we have this tendency now of people either immigrating from South Africa or trying to secure a homeland, self-determination, a folk start, whatever you want to call it, because they simply want peace. They simply want to be on their own. They don't want to bother people around them.
You're listening to Radio Free South Africa, broadcast on Reach Out America by World Integrity News Network. Our call-in number is 347-850-1243. This is your host, Karin Smith, and our guest today is Schalk van der Merwe, speaking to us from South Africa. Schalk, so yes, things have not changed from 1652 to today. It just doesn't seem to me that history doesn't stop repeating itself for these poor people. So, all right, so now we've kind of gotten to the struggle years.
Yes.
Now, the black people. Oh, I wanted to touch on this as well. During these hated apartheid years, the black population grew exponentially. They flocked into the white South Africa from all over Africa, looking for their place or their piece of the pie. And because of white medicine, etc., their expected life age increased, the baby deaths decreased, and the population exploded.
Yes, that's also a fact. Mortality rate decreased dramatically from where basically I don't know the exact numbers, but where basically half of your population or 2/3 of your population would have died at childbirth or the early developmental years. By the end of the apartheid years, the black people were actually on a standard that you would find in Europe and in some of the so-called first world countries, even America. Now that in itself, taking into regard the rest of Africa, was a tremendous achievement. Population growth. Now, population growth is one of the measures to see whether a population is actually doing good. The black population in South Africa in one century, and this is without immigration like you had in the United States, grew by not 90%, it grew by 900%. So in other words, there were nine times more black people in 2000 than there were in 1900. Now, if this picture of white people killing black people in mass and exploiting them and all these things that the media conjured up, if those were actually the realities, how is it possible that the population will grow by 900%? It simply doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't. And they flooded in from everywhere, even though they had their own self-ruled Bantustans, as it were. They did not want to be there. They wanted a part of the white technology, the white advancement, the white everything. But at the same time, they were getting incredibly good educations. And this is where 1976, the uprising in Soweto came from, was the standard of education. But they were getting really good education. They had schools and universities built and maintained by the white taxpayer. Their standard of living, from being nomads who followed the cattle, who didn't even have a written language, was incredibly advanced by the white South Africans. And they didn't have words in their language for scientific things. They didn't have words for the westernized culture. So how could they have been taught in their own language?
Yes, that relates to 1976. You must remember that even today, most of the black languages, and to me personally, I think that's a very wrong thing, but many of the black languages still can't describe subject matter in science, in maths, etc. Because it was never part of their culture. At this juncture, you see a huge Americanization and Anglicization of the population, the black population. They would rather at this juncture try to be Americans. Their clothing and the way that they speak, etc., would rather try to imitate the American people than their own culture. So I agree fully with you on that point. Yes, Karin.
But okay, so I'm kind of jumping around a little bit here, but it leads into what you just said. They want the Western culture. They want the benefits of Western civilization, but they do not want the Westerners.
Yeah. That's a very good summary of maybe the whole contradiction of being anti-colonialist. Now you must remember something. The original anti-colonialists of Africa were the Afrikaner people, were the Boer people. We fought a running battle with the British Empire for 200 years, two centuries. We forgot about how to fight the British. Only when the so-called African nationalists started to being in discontent against the British Empire. So it's this huge contradiction of the African person wanting all the benefits of Europe and all the benefits of the rest of the world, but they don't want to accept the rule or. I don't want to call it supremacy because it's not supremacy. It's simply trying to imitate another culture, but then not being willing to accept that culture in your midst. That's a very big contradiction. If you look at Mr. Mugabe dresses like an English gentleman would dress. He speaks the Queen's English. I sometimes sit and listen to his speeches, and I'm amazed at how that man can speak English. He speaks English better than myself. I'm also not a first language English speaking person. He speaks English better than myself. He has houses, castles in Switzerland. his money is lying in Europe in bank vaults. But for some reason, then he goes on national TV and he says, I don't even want to see a white person in my country. Now, how do you marry these two things? It's simply impossible.
Well, if you look at the rest of Africa that have decolonized, starting just in the Congo, what have they become, Schalk? They got rid of the whites. They got rid of colonial rule. What have they got left? They're flocking to South Africa.
Yes, that's
I just can't wrap my head around any of this.
That's a fact. You're speaking of the Congo now. It's these days called Zaire and Congo Brazzaville. It's a little bit further up in Africa, but we have a lot of immigrants coming from those areas. But speaking of Zimbabwe again. Zimbabwe was this breadbasket of Africa. It produced tobacco. It produced all kinds of farming goods. It actually had factories. It had a very well-developed schooling system. Then Mr. Mugabe came and for about 20 years, basically the same scenario as in South Africa, things actually went quite well. There wasn't too much eruptions. Then, unfortunately, opposition parties started rising, and I think he started to feel very threatened by what was going on. And the obvious target were the white people, and especially the white farmers. And they had this tremendous so-called redistribution of land, which was nothing else than so-called war veterans from the ZANU-PF going into farms and intimidating not only the white farmers, but also the black employees working for them. And they had to leave the farms, and these veterans simply took over the farmland. Now, for the life of me, how could those people then farm those farms? And that is exactly what happened. Those farms simply fell apart. There was nothing, at this point in time, there's basically nothing left. They couldn't farm it. In South Africa, we faced a very similar scenario with the first round of land redistribution, where they actually went and the government went and they bought farms to establish black farmers. But the people that they settled on those farms didn't have the faintest idea of how to farm the land. They didn't have the means. They didn't have the skills. They didn't have the capital to farm the lands. And everything fell apart. So it's basically a waste of money and time. But the problem is now you're facing food shortages in Zimbabwe because of that, and the people are flocking in their thousands, if not their millions, into South Africa for a better life, which again is this huge contradiction of we don't want to be ruled by white capital, and I'm now using the terms of for instance, the EFF, but if white capital is not there, we move to where it is. And it's a very huge contradiction.
But you're seeing that all over the world, Schalk, because those very same black people throughout Africa, I can't think of a single country they're not coming from. They are flocking in their hundreds of thousands to Europe, to the UK, to Australia, to New Zealand, to once again get their piece of the Western pie, which they do not want to contribute to. They do not want to work for. They do not want to assimilate. They do not want to live under white rule, but they want the benefits. And the whole world is feeling that right now.
Yes, I agree with you. It has become a global. I won't call it a crisis as yet, but it's definitely a problem. It's very problematic. I think you're referring to these huge amounts of immigrants leaving Africa, the African shores, building small boats and then going over the sea to Italy and south of France, etc. Once again, this is so contradictory. I'm not a racist person. I have black friends. I have black colleagues. I service black clients. So it's not a white-black thing, but it's this contradiction of the black people coming to a point, or some of them coming to a point where they go for communism and they go for socialism and they go for all these unworkable economic and political theories. And part of that is then to rid themselves of the so-called colonial chains that's holding them down. And then they make a mess up of things because the ideological stances that they take is simply not viable. Communism doesn't work. Socialism doesn't work. It's as simple as that. And then 20 or 30 years down the line, everybody is now dying of hunger, and then they want to move to those areas, which happen to be white, that is not ruled by communists and not ruled by socialists.
But they want to take the same ideas with them. They want to take the same ideas with them because they don't seem to learn from the history of what has happened.
Yes, that's a fact.
It's very strange. It is very strange to me. All right, so we were kind of in the struggle years. So the South African government was basically defending themselves from a terrorist onslaught from all around them because they are on the tip of Africa. They are surrounded by they're the last outpost of white in Africa, actually. So they were surrounded by civil war in Zimbabwe, civil war in Angola, civil war in Mozambique. Namibia was being taken over, and they found themselves in a very serious situation. And the rest of the world's answer to that was sanctions.
Yeah, but there's, once again, and we're speaking a lot of contradictions tonight. South Africa was seen, you're quite right, in the more colonial ideology. It was seen as the so-called last outpost of the Western world, etc. But as I said earlier, it was also seen as the bulwark against communism, and therefore, for instance, the Reagan government, behind the scenes, they contributed to the South African war effort in Angola when we were fighting SWAPO and the ANC in Angola, and I want to come back to that point. The British government, they also supported us. Margaret Thatcher was one of the personal friends of Mr. P.W. Botha, who was the so-called last apartheid ruler of South Africa. So you had this huge contradiction of in the media, it was this very bad thing that was happening, and everybody was sanctioning, and the UN were taking measures. But behind the scenes, we were actually used as the dogs of war to stop communism in Africa, and that's a very huge contradiction. Yes, coming back to Angola, what we must never forget. Once again, it's the media that conjures up this image of a white government fighting the whole of Black Africa. That was simply not what was going on in the Angolan war. At any point in time, there were no more than 2,000 to 3,000 South African troops that were deployed in the operational areas. At no point in time. We were a very small force that were fighting against communists, not black people. We were fighting communists.
The Cubans and the Russians, because the Cubans in Angola were training the MK people, and the Russians were going over to Russia to Patrice Lumumba University, etc., and being trained. So the South African government was basically fighting these two communist countries. Yes, you must remember something, the Bush War, for instance. If you look at the real frontline fighting that took place, of course you had the white units that were fighting in the operational areas, but then you had purely black units. The very famed 32 Battalion, for instance, was a wholly black unit. There were whole units, whole divisions, whole battalions of colored people. Now, colored people in South Africa is different from what Americans perceive colored people to be. A colored person is a person of Malay descent. They are not black people. They are people that were brought in as slaves during the first part of the Dutch colonial era. There were whole divisions and battalions of them fighting. There were people that's today called the Khoisan, the Bushman people. They were fighting. In Southwest Africa, the Ovambo people, there were units that were raised from the Ovambo people to fight against the communists. So it wasn't a black-white war. It was a war of democracy and the West type of life against communism. Now let's get back to what was going on in Angola at that point in time. Angola was run by the government of the MPLA. Now the MPLA was hardline communists, hardline.
And they were running the country, and they were bolstered by Cubans. Now, Cuba, of course, at that stage was already Castro's Cuba, that's purely communist, and they were bolstered also by the Russians, even the East Germans. So in the latter parts of the Bush War, we're not fighting against the SWAPO or the ANC. We were fighting a conventional war against the MPLA government, regular troops, bolstered by Russians and Cubans. That was the Angolan War. It was not this type of image, once again, that the media is trying to conjure up of the brave ANC insurgent fighting against the oppressive white man in Angola. That never happened. It's simply not the truth. It's a lie. We were fighting against a communist regime. That's the long and the short of it.
Yeah, Schalk, there's so much that the world has been misled on about South Africa. It is frightening to me, the perceptions in the outside world about who we are and what we did, because the Afrikaner nation are God-fearing, Christian, hard-working, independent, stubborn people who only want a piece of land to call their own. They do not want to fight. They do not want to rule anybody. They just want a place where they can call home and be allowed to live in peace. And that has not changed since before they left the Netherlands and the other places they come from to today. And yet they are the most maligned, misunderstood, misrepresented people in history, just about.
I think the last term that you use sums it up the best. I think the Afrikaners now, who are the Afrikaner people? In South Africa, you have many people that say that there's a difference between the Boer people and the Afrikaner people, etc. But to me, those are superficial. Afrikaner people are the white people in South Africa adhering to Western standards, mostly speaking Afrikaans as a language, some English-speaking people, being Christian mostly in faith. That's the Afrikaner nation. And when you say that the Afrikaner people are the most unrepresented people, that sums up the problem. We're not the bad guys. We simply just don't have the advocates to tell the rest of the world we're actually the good guys. And we've been blamed for everything. We've been blamed for so-called apartheid. We didn't invent apartheid. We inherited from the British. When you touched earlier on the mass migration of the black people into white areas, it was because of economics more than anything else. It was British-run companies at that stage that took black people as laborers, and let's be honest about it, as slave labor. They were paid a menial fee to work in British-owned companies in the white areas. When the apartheid government came into being in 1948, their living standards improved hugely because of the Afrikaners. We went to the British and we told them, you can't treat the workers like this. And we made laws to regulate that. So we actually, you're quite right, we're being misrepresented and underrepresented. And that is why the rest of the world believes we are the scoundrels. But we are not. We are simply not.
No,
I can quote this to you.
Sorry, Schalk, finish your thought.
I want to quote this, well, not to quote, I want to give this idea to you. The previous governor of the South African Reserve Bank, Mr. Tito Mboweni, now he was also a hardline communist. He learned the ropes in Cuba. He came back to South Africa and he became the governor of the South African Reserve Bank. He said in so many words, he don't want black workers to work for him because they are disloyal. He wants the Afrikaners in the Reserve Bank to stay on and work for him because he can rely on them. Now, if a black communist, in other words, a black nationalist with a communist inclination says that about Afrikaner people, then how can we be the scoundrels of this whole picture?
Yes, Schalk, because the Afrikaners are basically a paternalistic society. The man is head of the house, as it says in the Bible, and everything that he says is the way to go. But his workers become part of his family and his responsibility. And yes, there are people who treat their servants badly. I cannot deny that. But in general, the Afrikaans patriarch accepts his responsibility of feeding, housing, educating, looking after, hospitalizing his people. So, and that is the thing that I have seen throughout South Africa, from farmers to mine workers to the gardener at your home. So we were not, there's always the exception to the rule, but in general, we were not cruel and still are to this day not cruel to these people.
That's a fact, and I always take black and white, and I put those two together because grey causes us to lose sight of things. Let's take the so-called black, the worst case scenario. What happened in Australia when the British colonized Australia? They exterminated a whole population.
Yep.
They exterminated the Aborigines. They went out in hunting parties and they killed off these people until the 1950s and 60s. They killed these people off as animals.
Yes.
In South African history, that never happened. The example is always made. We make the joke to say that we went into the interior of South Africa with the gun in the one hand and the Bible in the other, and we used the Bible more than the gun, and that's exactly what happened. You're quite right about the paternalistic way of the Afrikaner society. When the black people started to work for the Afrikaners, we cared for them as part of our families. I grew up on a farm where our farm workers were treated as part of the family. When we received clothes, we would usually have bought them clothes. When we came to the farm on the weekends, we would bring their groceries for them. So they were part of the family. That is how the setup was run. And that is why the so-called miracle of South Africa, of the new South Africa, came to being. This theory of, but why didn't a civil war erupt? Why wasn't there a mass genocide at the turn of this century when the armed struggle took place? It's very simple why it didn't happen. It didn't happen because there was no hate against the white people. The ANC and the SACP, the Communist Party and the PAC, they were running this lie of this huge mass discontent of black people against the white government and white people in general, which was simply not the truth. There wasn't hate, and that is why there was no big mass slaughter of white people like you saw in the colonial empires of Europe. That is why you didn't see this huge driving out of people like you had in Mozambique and Angola and all these other places. The Congo, you mentioned Congo previously. When the Belgians left there, it was simple chaos. They hunted the white people down. Never happened in South Africa because of the society that we came out of.
That the white people created of their own free will. They were not forced into it. That is how the Afrikaner is. I can't stress enough what good people the Afrikaner race are. They are kind, warm-hearted, Christian, forgiving, and stubborn as hell. I mean, there's no question about that. They are stubborn, but they don't want to rule, destroy, fight with anybody.
Yes, that's fact. If you look at the intentions of Verwoerdian apartheid, the intention was to create what was called grand apartheid. Your listeners can maybe, if they want to, they can go and read up on the term grand apartheid. Grand apartheid was basically what is today called self-determination. Now in Yugoslavia, after the fall of communism, you had this huge blow-up, and later on the Americans bombed living daylights out of the Serbians, and there was this huge civil war and genocide and everything that took place. And in the end, they settled the whole thing by giving self-determination to the Serbian people and the Bosnian people and the Croats and all these people. Everybody received their self-determination. That was basically what was grand apartheid's end purpose, to create a host of independent nations in South Africa ruling themselves. The Zulu people in KwaZulu-Natal, or in KwaZulu, the Xhosa people in Transkei, the Tswana people in Bophuthatswana, and I can go on. There were 13 different Bantustans. That was the purpose of grand apartheid, to create independent nations. And it was not only intended, it actually happened. Transkei was an independent nation under apartheid. Ciskei was an independent nation. The Zulu people didn't want to become independent because the king was paid a huge salary by the South African government. That's why KwaZulu remained a homeland and it didn't become an independent state.
We are coming up to an ad break. Schalk, you have about 6 minutes to get yourself a cup of tea or whatever is required, and we will be back.
Thank you, Karin.
And we're back with Radio Free South Africa, broadcasting on Reach Out America with the World Integrity News Network. This is your host, Karin Smith. Our call-in number, oh my Lord, I've lost it. It's 347-850-1243. And our guest today is Schalk van der Merwe from South Africa. And we're back, Schalk. So we've talked an awful lot about the history leading up to where we are today and how South Africa got to be a powerhouse and a net exporter of food and a world power. And then, we need to go back to about 1976, the freedom struggle, how we got to be where we are at today.
Yes, Karin. Yeah, if I can maybe start with the multi-party negotiations that led up to the new South Africa. Maybe that's a good departure point.
It's a very good place to start because nobody understands that. That is a question I'm asked all the time. How did that happen?
Yes. Throughout the late 70s and even the 80s, you had a lot of dialogue behind the scenes and sometimes highly secretive between the government and so-called liberation organizations. Now, let's just look for a moment at what the liberation organization in South Africa is supposed to be. Those are what the Americans term terrorist organizations. Those were the ANC, the PAC. Now, an offshoot, the military wing of the PAC was the very notorious APLA. They were people that bombed churches, white churches, and stuff like that. The ANC had a military wing. It was called MK, Mkhonto Wesizwe, which simply means the spear of the nation. It was this terrible terrorist organizations, and it was a reign of terror. They tried to immerse the country in. A person, and I'm going to call a name now, Mr. Robert McBride. He's these days still very involved in the administration of the New South Africa. He was, for instance, very notorious in bombing a bar, Magoo's Bar, where they simply went for a soft target. People coming from work, having a drink, and they were bombed. So it was this tremendous terrorist war that was waged, and not only in the white areas, also in the black areas. You must remember that the major part of the so-called struggle against apartheid didn't take place in the white areas. It took place in the black townships, where they tried to destabilize the black townships to a point where the South African government could not govern anymore. Their call was indeed to create an ungovernable South Africa. So you had, for instance, the very notorious necklacing, where a so-called impimpi, now that's a person that worked with the South African government. He was maybe an informer, alleged informer. They would catch those people, and they would literally put an old car tire around his neck, throw gasoline on it, and then they would torch that person. That is how they had a reign of terror in the black areas. Now, with that background, the South African government also was sanctioned from outside. You mentioned sanctions previously. We were culturally sanctioned. We couldn't take part in the cultural activities of the world. We were economically sanctioned. We couldn't export certain things and import certain things. Many international companies, simply withdrew out of South Africa, so we couldn't utilize their products. We were basically isolated from the rest of the world. And with that in mind, the South African government started to speak behind the scenes with these liberation organizations. And that led up to the release of Mr. Nelson Mandela, the debanning of the liberation organizations as communist and terrorist organizations. And then a process, it was called Kudesa, took place where all these parties, the Nationalist Party government, certain other white groups, and all the black so-called liberation organizations came together, and they started negotiating to have a peaceful transition from the old South African white-ruled government system to where it was supposed to be a multinational and multicultural democratic South Africa. Now, from that process came a constitution, an interim constitution in 1993, and it was panel beaten a little bit, and by 1996 it was adopted as the Constitution of South Africa. It was, to my, and I'm a lawyer, to my mind it was quite a sound document. But remember, this is Africa, so documents doesn't count very much in Africa. It was a very liberal type of constitution with a lot of emphasis on individual rights, on property rights, all these things. So it was a good working document. But unfortunately, through the mechanisms of state, through the years, through 20 years of ANC rule, the constitution, the values of the constitution has been eroded to a point that the constitution basically has very little, if any, actual influence in society anymore. I just want to point this out to the listeners. They must remember that the ANC came to power in South Africa through a democratic process. The process in South Africa is democratic. Every 4 years, every 5 years, we have an election. It's usually deemed to be free and fair. There's not much criticism from the outside world. But here's the practical problem. The majority people in South Africa are black people. The white population is only about, different figures say, 5% to 8%. So it's a very small minority. So most people are black. The ANC is still seen as the liberation organization. It's still seen as the mother of everything. And most black people vote ANC just simply because they vote ANC. And that is the reason why for 20 years the ANC has been in power. It has managed South Africa from where we were a powerhouse to basically where we are now a failing state, but the average black voter doesn't see that. For him, it's more important to have a black liberation, so-called liberation organization running the country, receiving his monthly allowance, his social grant, what it's called, receiving maybe a small little house that the government built for him. So those things are much more important to him than the actual economy of the country, and the actual political development of the country, education, all these things. And they keep on voting the ANC in. And I cannot foresee that the ANC will be voted out unless another more radical black party takes over. And at this point in time, it's the EFF, which is a really very scary monster that we have to deal with.
And they have the backing of the disaffected, unemployed black youth, of which there are thousands. Yes. In the last elections last year, this was the first elections that the EFF, now I'm going to explain to the listeners how they came to be in a moment, but they gathered more than 1 million votes first time out. In other words, 1 million radical black people today are voting for and supporting the EFF. Maybe at this point in time, many more. You're quite right. The ANC, the EFF, it draws its support base from mainly two places. It draws it from the very discontented black youth that cannot be employed, is unemployable. The education system has basically failed him. You can't employ him in a business, so he's sitting at home, and he's being promised and conjured up all these wonderful things that the EFF will give him. Now, not relating to the white people, but what the EFF is saying, the ANC failed you. So that is why you must vote for us. That's the EFF. We are even more radical. We will even promise you more than what the ANC is doing. So that's the first part of their support base. The second part, and this is very ironic, seems to be the black intelligentsia in South Africa. The more schooled black person.
For him, the allure is maybe black nationalism, the romanticism around that, but also the economic stance of the EFF that says everything must be taken from white capital and given to black people. Now, we know it can't happen, but that's the promise that the EFF is making, and people are falling for it.
And at the same time, Malema, who is the leader of the EFF, is talking out both sides of his mouth, because he says there will be no white genocide once the EFF become the rulers of this country. But in the next breath, nationalize everything. The honeymoon for whites is over. Stealing from the whites is not really stealing, it's just redistributing, taking what you owned in the first place. This man is extremely dangerous. But the young black people they seem to see him as a hero, because he's a picture of what they can become, and it's only the whites that are holding them back.
Yes, that's the picture that's being portrayed by the EFF. Now, let's just for a moment stand at where the EFF comes from, because even to South Africans, this has been a phenomenon that we can't really explain. You have the ANC that's been ruling the country now for 2 decades. And the ANC, in its own mechanisms and its own ideology, started to move slightly from the far left and the communist more to the center. They are still socialists. They are still a left-wing ideological party. There's no two ways about that. But they started to move into the direction of a free market economy. Now, the ANC is in alliance with the SACP, that's the South African Communist Party, and COSATU. Now, COSATU is it's a confederation of South African trade unions. So you can see this is a very leftist, communist type of alliance that's covering the country. But now, as things happen, I think at the stage they started to realize that their own ideologies can't really work. Maybe on a theoretical plane it can work, but the reality of South Africa is that you can't get away from the free market economy. You can't get away from the capitalist system of doing things. We know you can't, because communism simply doesn't work. You can't go on with it. It's an unsustainable political and economic system. So the ANC has started to move in a direction where they have become more timid, maybe not as evil as previously, although they are still left. Now, within their ranks grew a lot of discontent about this. There were the more radical African nationalists and leftists that said, but you're too soft on these white people. Look what apartheid did to us. Look how we've been killed, how we were killed under apartheid, how they took everything, how we were basically slaves in South Africa. This whole thing that I mentioned previously, this narrative that was created during the struggle of apartheid. So there was a lot of discontent inside the ANC. And then on a personal level, this Mr. Malema, he was the supporter of Zuma when they got rid of the previous president, Mbeki. So he actually supported Zuma on a personal level. But like politics work, at the stage they also started to fight one another. And then Malema was kicked out of the ANC. Now, everybody at that stage thought that Malema will simply just disappear. But the opposite happened. He managed to organize himself into an organization that was later registered as a political party, being the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF. And it's this party that I'm speaking about now that actually had 1 million votes in the last elections. This is a very serious problem. And you're quite right. On one hand, Mr. Malema is speaking to white farmers in Stellenbosch, but then the very next day he goes into the media and he simply lashes out against the white people of South Africa. So it's a very difficult thing to summarize, but to me, I'm not going to take chances with this man. He's radical, he's populist, he's a very great threat to us at this point in time.
And a student and friend of Mr. Mugabe.
Yes, indeed. I'm speculating now. I can't say this is what's going on in Mr. Malema's head. I think Mr. Malema is seeing himself as the next great dictator of Africa. I think he's modeling himself on previous great dictators like Idi Amin, like those, because the rhetoric that you're hearing from him is exactly the same as that came from those people. I think in the end, we are maybe looking at the greater South Africa. Maybe in his mind he's seeing a greater South Africa. They won't call it South Africa. He's already said the name must be called to Azania. That's the term that was used in the struggle years to describe South Africa. So you will see his greater Azania as being South Africa. He's trying to destabilize Botswana. He was actually banned from coming into Botswana. Obviously Zimbabwe that's financing him, and maybe Namibia. So maybe he's in his mind he's seeing a lot more than simply taking over power in South Africa. I'm speculating. No, nobody is saying that this is indeed so, but this is to me, my own personal view, this is maybe what's going on here.
It would appear so, because I think he has plans way above his wage level, but we did think he would go away, and he did not. He came back with even greater support. Plus, the court cases against him by the revenue services, etc., have been dropped, as happens with all the court cases against the politicians in South Africa. So the man is free to do whatever he likes, and I do believe that he is gaining incredible support from the disaffected, unemployed, unemployable black youth, and there are a lot of them. So that man is one of the dangers that faces the white South Africans. The other thing that we need to talk about is the affiliation with BRICS, because Cubans are being brought in at a rate of knots as doctors in the hospitals, as mechanics, any job that the whites who are disenfranchised in South Africa. There are many of them that could fill those positions, but the government has stated rather keep them empty than give them to a white. So they've brought in Cubans to fill those positions, and Chinese have been declared black so that they do not have to comply with the BBBE laws. And now we're signing a nuclear deal with Russia. South Africa is in a mess. And nobody is really paying attention to their membership of BRICS. But it would appear to me, on the outside looking in, that this is having a much bigger effect on South Africa than anyone is giving it credit for.
Karin, yes, this is a very interesting point that you're coming to. And now we're speaking even beyond the inner problems of South Africa. We're now looking at geopolitics, basically. Through the years, of course, we have had, after the Cold War, the fall of the old Soviet Union, we still had a huge rivalry between the great powers of the world, being the United States being one, the upcoming communist China being the other. I don't have to tell the American listeners of how dangerous China is for instance, to the US. India. People sometimes miss the growth of India. India is now the largest by a huge margin, the largest democratic country in the world. It's a country with 1.2 billion people. 1.2 billion people. So India is rising, and you have China rising. Russia has made a comeback. When the Soviet Union folded, Russia was in very, very deep trouble, and they came back. They're once again a great power. So much so that I think during the last elections, Mitt Romney made a statement, and he was laughed off at the time. And I think that maybe you should have listened to Mitt Romney. He said our biggest problem, and our being that the US's biggest problem, is Russia. And I think on a geopolitical scale, we are now seeing the clashing and the playing out of all those power struggles. And once again, where do we see the focus of that? South Africa. Mm-hmm. This is the reason why South Africa is strategically the most suited place on earth. If you have control of South Africa, you control the Atlantic Ocean and you control the Indian Ocean. and you control the oil route from the Middle East, and you control the trade routes to the Far East. So if you control South Africa, you control the world. And once again, you're seeing the playing off of those power games in South Africa. I want to come back to BRICS. I'm very sure I still have time to do that, Karin?
Yes, you do. There's plenty time left. We still have half an hour.
Thanks. Now, for the American listeners, BRICS is basically an alliance, like you have NATO in Europe and the US. They have NATO, etc. And the European Union. BRICS is a macro alliance between certain countries in the world. Being Brazil, now Brazil we know is leftist at this point in time. Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, why do you have these huge, big countries and then the small one, South Africa? Back to my previous point, South Africa is the most strategic point in the world. In terms of BRICS, it's basically economic, but also politically, it's an alliance between these countries. Here's the thing. On the Security Council of the United Nations, you have Russia and you have China. So if anything strange happens in South Africa that needs the United Nations to really react on it, then we have a problem, because two countries are going to veto us, that being China and Russia. So that's creating a huge problem for us. Economically, where previously our biggest trade partners were countries like Germany, like the UK, Britain, like the US. At this point in time, the whole focus is shifting to the east, to China. Now, we know that China is basically colonizing Africa. If you move north of the border of South Africa, you find Chinese everywhere. They are building roads, they are building new cities, they are building railways, they are everywhere. So South Africa has become a colonial empire for the Chinese people. And you've seen a huge influx of Chinese people and capital into South Africa. Let me give you one example. In the midst of Johannesburg, just south of Sandton, now for the American businessman doing business in South Africa, Sandton must ring a bell, because Sandton is the most valuable part of Africa. Basically, all the international companies have their headquarters in Sandton. Just south to Sandton in Modderfontein, the Chinese are building a new super city to the value of $84 billion. They are building a new city, the Chinese people. Now, what is that telling you? The whole focus, the whole economic and political shift has already taken place in South Africa. Okay, what does that mean to white people? A lot of talk at this stage, especially in the more conservative spectrum of the Afrikaners and the white people, focuses on the discrimination against the white people through the laws of employment equity, but more so that there's maybe an organized genocide against us taking place. Now, if you look at the definition of genocide, it doesn't mean it's a lot of people running around with pankas and cutting up another race group. It can be economic also. It can be regarding their language also. It can be their culture also. And all those elements are present at this point in time. Now, if a genocide against white people are taking place in South Africa, how can we stop that? Only by sanctions from the outside and the International Criminal Court taking a stance on this. Will that happen if China is the predominant country in South Africa? I don't believe so. So it's on geopolitical scale. We're now facing the problem of the white South Africans. Where are we going to be left if this whole thing is playing itself out on a geopolitical scale? I don't know. I'm very scared of the future.
You're listening to Radio Free South Africa, broadcasting on Reach Out America with the World Integrity News Network. This is Karin Smith, your host, and our guest today is Schalk van der Merwe from South Africa. Schalk, that is one of my biggest fears, because the Chinese have been declared black in South Africa. And we do have half an hour left to talk about the BBBEE laws, which are the basis of the disenfranchisement of the whites in South Africa. Now, as far as I can see it, the reason for declaring the Chinese black was so that they do not have to comply with those laws.
I can agree with you. Here's a semi-legal point of view on this. I don't think that we can just simply say Chinese people were declared as black people so that they can take over the country. The reason why. The court case that declared Chinese people to be blacks under the laws of Black Empowerment, Broad-Based Black Empowerment. That court case related to Chinese people that were living in South Africa before the new South Africa. Okay. In other words, those people that were already here when the new South Africa took place. Here's the practical problem. How do you distinguish between those people and the Chinese people that's been flocking in the last two decades? How do you know that person is actually a so-called black Chinese then? It's simply impossible. Yes, the B laws themselves, the stated objective of the B laws is simply to give entrance of black people into the economy of South Africa. Unfortunately, once again, the practical problem, the outflow of that was that white people have been disenfranchised. White people basically in their own country have become economic refugees. Now, why do I say that? It's quite a far-reaching statement to make. The laws of black empowerment relates to business ownership. It relates to procurement of businesses. In other words, you're supposed to buy, your business is supposed to buy from a black empowered business. It relates to employment equity. Now, employment equity is just a nice South African term for affirmative action. And I could go on. So it's economic, and it's keeping white people out of the economy. It's turning white companies into black companies. Because if you want to comply with the B laws, there's a whole host of measures that you must comply with. And it basically turns your company from a white-owned company into a black-owned company, from a majority white skilled labor company into a black labor company. That's the net effect of this. Now, it's a very controversial issue at this stage in South Africa. There are even white people that saying black empowerment is a good thing. Yes, all the bad things that we did in the years of apartheid, it must be corrected now. There must be a redress. The word that's been used is a redressing of the past. Unfortunately, the net effect of this is that the small white minority is now being kicked out of the economy. Now, where must they go? If they can't start a business because it must comply with black empowerment, and they can't find a job because of employment equity, where must they go? What must they do? It's very easy to say, yeah, but they must leave. Send them back to Europe. Send them over the seas. To now immigrate to the UK, I read recently, will cost you more than 10 million rand. Now, I'm not sure on the exchange rate how much dollars that is, but the average South African don't even earn 10 million rand in his whole life. So how is it possible for that person then to move overseas? So they're basically stuck. If you're out of a job now and you're white, you're going to end up as a impoverished person in a squatter camp. That's your foresight.
Yeah, there is a job or a squatter camp. That is literally the choice for a white person in South Africa. Because if you lose your job, you will not get another one. And now we are looking at all the upcoming layoffs. I know the unions are fighting it, but I looked at a figure this morning and I was gobsmacked. 190,000 in the mines.
Yes, Karin, and now we're getting to that point that I also alluded to earlier. When failed economic policies start to take hold, it's 20 years on. By this time, all these socialist experiments and the B experiment and all these experiments on the economy is backfiring. You have the rand. It's a South African currency. The rand is taking a knock. It's standing at a level that last it stood 14 years ago. And 14 years ago, what caused that was disruptions in Zimbabwe when Mugabe started to bully out all the white people. So we're actually at that same crisis point today. So the currency is falling. Huge problem for South Africa relating to imports, of course. Commodities. Now, South Africa is a country, as I said previously, that the economy is to a large extent based on the production of commodities, foodstuffs, etc., but more so minerals. We export a huge amount of raw materials into the world. So commodity prices, that's key to South Africans' economic survival. And commodity prices are at their lowest prices in decades. Worldwide. So in other words, that is now also contributing. Inside South Africa, because of BEE and affirmative action, you had a huge outflow of skilled white workers from the country in previous years. I think a city like London has about 250,000 white South Africans living there now. A country like Australia has nearly 500,000 white people living there. South African white people. So all those skills have been extracted out of the economy, and the economy is basically imploding. Okay, now what's going on now? Every year, around the middle of the year to Christmas, you will have the trade unions, COSATU, coming to big business in South Africa, mining industry, etc., and then demanding huge pay rises and all kinds of benefits and all kinds of promises they make to their members. And then usually it will end up in a deadlock between the employers and the unions, and they will go on strike. Now, you will remember the huge strike in the platinum industry of past years that actually caused the whole platinum industry to implode. It literally imploded to an extent that the price of platinum worldwide was affected, that nobody is buying platinum anymore. And we're facing that again. Now, taking the background that I just gave, the mines simply at this point in time cannot take a strike anymore, because the input cost is too high. If they now go on strike and production losses start taking an effect, the mines are going to go bust. So the mines are pretty empty. The mines are saying, okay, if this happens, we're going to lay off. We're going to start to retrench. And you're quite right. The numbers are simply staggering. The mines directly are speaking of more than 150,000 people that will be retrenched and that lose their work. But you must remember that the mining industry is not only the mine itself. There's also a host of supporting businesses and suppliers to the mines. So the moment the mine starts to retrench and the production starts to fall, it also affects those businesses. There's another knock-on effect that's not often seen so much. If you go and retrench 150,000+ people, you're basically cutting out a significant part of the tax base. Now, South Africa is already skewed terribly relating to tax. We have a very small amount, about 6 million people in South Africa paying tax out of a population of nearly 60 million. So only 10% of the population are paying taxes, because at the lower level they are declared free of paying taxes. Many of the mine workers are actually on a higher scale of pay. And if you retrench those people, the government is going to lose the tax that would have been taken from them. So it becomes a perfect storm that's taking place now.
And not only the income taxes from the people, but from the companies themselves, which is massive.
Of course, from the companies themselves. VAT. Now, VAT it's value-added tax. It's a strange tax that was invented many years ago that basically says that for everything that you sell, you must pay the government 14% of the selling price. It's not that easy. I'm just oversimplifying it to make the example. Now, if the income and the selling and the business, the actual business starts to slow down, then VAT also reduces significantly, because people are not selling and people are not buying. That is the lubricating agent, lubricating factor in South Africa relating to finance. If the government doesn't have the VAT that's being paid over by businesses every month. They simply don't have cash flow. It's as simple as that. Now, we're business people. I'm more a business people than a lawyer because I have businesses that I own. I know that I don't have, if I don't have cash flow, it's the end of my business. And that is literally what we are facing at this stage.
And I see that Standard & Poor's and the rest of them are threatening to downgrade South Africa to junk status. And given that, there will be no foreign investment.
Karin, here's the thing. The government is very, very fast to say if there is discontent from the white community and we criticize government. Government is very easy to say, but you're saying this because you're racist. Right? You're seeing it also in America. If you criticize Mr. Obama, that's technically more white maybe than myself. I'm making a little joke now. But if you criticize Mr. Obama, then you're supposedly a racist. The moment that you criticize the ANC government, you branded a racist. But it's not only the white community that's criticizing. It's also the black community that's criticizing. From in the ranks of the ANC, they are criticizing. And even now, you're quite right, S&P, Standard & Poor, and certain of the other ratings companies, they are seeing what's happening. And on an objective base, they are downgrading South Africa. And they're going to downgrade South Africa to junk status, and then we're going to lose all investments, and companies are going to extract from South Africa.
Now, we were talking about the mines. Now, on the mines in South Africa, you have mine houses, you have mine hostels. Your job is linked to your home, to your transport, to just about everything. So the loss of a mine job in South Africa is a huge, huge loss because you lose all the benefits that go with it.
That's a fact. I'm living in an area of South Africa. I'm not going to disclose exactly where I live, but that's heavily dependent on mining. And you're 100% correct in your summary. You must remember that we spoke about the paternalistic nature of things in South Africa. The mines are quite paternalistic. They care for their workers. They care for their healthcare. For instance, very close to me is a huge hospital that was built by a mining house that services the community. It closed down incidentally a couple of months ago. Housing, quite truly, that's also basically the mines were built housing and hostels and so forth. So it's a huge social impact that's coming because of the retrenchments. What's 150,000 people going to do now? But we're not only speaking about 150,000 people. In South Africa, it's calculated that for every job, 8 people are being cared for. Every job, in other words, relate to 8 people, 8 mouths that's feeding from that job. So you can multiply 150,000 times 8, and you can see where you get. Of people that literally now will not have any job opportunities again.
And this is not a racial thing. This is black and white people who are going to be thrown out onto the dirt heap of society because they lost their job. Because all of us, most people live from paycheck to paycheck. So you are one paycheck away. Now, you've lost your house, you've lost your company vehicle. Where do you go from there? Because people do not have savings due to the economic situation in South Africa. You can maybe survive a couple of months, and then what?
Exactly. And it's very significant what you're saying. Remember the B laws and all these economic experiments and communism and all these things. It's very easy to say, yeah, but it's only the white people that's now suffering. It's only the white people that's complaining. You know, Karin, it's not.
No.
The average black South African is today, in my opinion, worse off than he was ever. The people that's going to be retrenched from the mines, maybe there's 20,000 or 20,000, 15,000 white people between those 150,000 people. The vast majority of layoffs will be black people. Now, where will that black person get a job again? He started as a mine worker. As a young man, he went into the mine. He was trained up to be a mine worker. How do you reskill and redeploy that person? It's simply impossible. It can't be done.
So now you're going to have a bunch more, white and black, and unskilled, because there's no more mining jobs for them. So basically unskilled, educated in only one area, on the street. Now,
Yeah.
and as you said, you take that 150,000 and you multiply it by 8. And those are the people now who are going to be, once again, totally disenfranchised. Add to that the junk status of South Africa and the possibility of foreign companies retrenching and leaving. Where does that leave that 6 million tax base?
That leaves that tax base to a point where we are already the most taxed people in the world. The second most taxed people are living in Sweden and Finland. They enjoy huge social benefits because they are paying high tax. We have basically nothing. Our roads are cracking up. Our sewerage are running in the streets. It's chaos. We're not being serviced by government. Our police service is falling apart. Our defense force is basically falling apart. All the services that you pay with your tax money, those services are not delivered. So in other words, we are overtaxed, and we're not getting anything in return for it. Now, the Minister of Finance actually warned us. He went so far as to say with his budget speech now that next year taxes will be increased. Now, how do you increase people that are already paying the most tax in the world? How do you do that? So now you're killing off the goose that's not even laying golden eggs anymore.
No.
It's simply laying eggs. You're killing that goose now, because the average taxpayer is going to fold. There's no way that he's going to survive this. Why is he not going to survive this? Not only is taxes going up, we've seen electricity prices skyrocketing because we're sitting with one monopoly, Eskom. I alluded to Eskom a little earlier. Eskom is still in existence, although in a totally disrupted state at this point in time. Eskom can't go on. There's blackouts on a daily basis in South Africa. We actually have apps. You can download an app to indicate when the blackout is going to be in your area. How totally ludicrous is that for a country? So you have a non-delivery of power, but you're still paying a lot more for your power. We are at the point where there's going to be what's called water shedding. We have the term load shedding referring to electricity. Water shedding is going to be that they're going to black out the delivery of water because the dams are falling apart. The infrastructure of the water is falling apart. So that's going to come up, and once again it costs the taxpayer more. Petrol. Now, fortunately, the oil price is falling, but as I said previously, the rand, the currency is falling even faster than that. So we've seen a huge increase in the cost of gasoline, petrol, like we call it in South Africa, and diesel and fuel in South Africa. So the taxpayer must also pay more on that. The interest rate in South Africa, it has been raised now by the Reserve Bank already, and they warned the South African clients, the banking clients, and they said to them, we are now on an upwards trend in interest. Now, the car that you're driving, the house that you're living, you're renting it from the bank effectively, and you're paying interest on that loan. So the taxpayer is now taking a beating from all sides, and it must fold. At some point in time, you can't go on like this. It must give way, and I think we're very close to that crisis point.
Hello, Scott Caller. You're live on Radio Free South Africa. Do you have a question for our guest?
Yeah, I was just wondering what the situation is with why South Africans don't seem to be able to actually implement solutions, because the solutions have been around for a long time. But a country like Japan can recover very quickly from a major crisis, but we seem to be tagging along for like 25 years without changing anything.
Schalk, I don't know if you heard that. The caller is asking why is it that South Africa can't implement solutions where a country like Japan has done it, and South Africa's been going along, limping along for 20 years without any solutions.
Because Japan is Japan. The Japanese people, the culture, the politics, the economics, everything in Japan, and you can very easily also point to Germany after the Second World War. It's a totally different ballgame. You're sitting with a communist government that still believes that communism and socialism can work, and they're implementing economic strategies relating to that. So economically, we're not limping, as the caller is saying. We came from a very high point, and we started to decline. So it's not actually limping, we're declining. And the government simply doesn't see its own fault. It won't admit its own fault, because then it will have to take responsibility for the mess that we... You can't compare Japan and South Africa. That's comparing apples with pears. But I think it's a fair question that your listener asked, but it's something you can't compare the two.
But you can compare the two, because I just did. You know, I mean, essentially, I think that South Africa, you know, if that's how, you know, if that's what's going to happen, that's what's going to happen. You know, essentially, because if you've got a balance of people that have a vested interest and a lot of money power behind them to turn South Africa into a controlled nation that's very much more sort of communist, then, you know, if there's not enough people in the country that have the knowledge to withstand that, then it's almost like a predetermined outcome. That barring some external major force to educate people as to the opportunities and alternatives, it is going to become a communist nation.
Did you hear that, Schalk?
I didn't follow, unfortunately, Karin.
All right, he says you can compare the two because he just did. And he says if there are not enough people to turn it around, or with the will to turn it around, you are going to predeterminedly become a communist nation.
But it's not like necessarily cloaked in communism. It's just sort of what happens.
We're going to become a communist nation. We're already a communist nation, but we're at a point, for instance, that the best comparison between ourselves and another country would be the Soviet Union in its later years, and specifically Romania. You have a lot of similar policies than you had under the Ceausescu regime in Romania in the last years. So you have this downward spiral. I agree with what the caller is saying. If we had a rational government and we had enough people thinking rationally about this thing, of course we can turn around. But the practical problem is we don't have it. We simply don't have it.
Yes. So I think then the reality of the situation is that you know, people are only a certain. It's like that in anything, really. Only a certain amount of people are going to survive or thrive, and the majority of the people will be oppressed. That's what happens. That's what's happening around the world. It's happening in China as well. There's a small elite which rules over everybody else, and so at the end of the day, you know, that's what is projected to happen. And so we can complain about it and say, oh dear, well, you know, we're not quite getting there, and it is very sad. But you know, statistics and trends and that sort of thing do show that the vast majority of people are going to end up like in a sort of a surf state. Because that's the MO. The government was never created. It was never created for the little guy. And that's what I don't understand about a lot of the radio shows. People say, why isn't the government doing something? Well, because the government was never created for the little guy.
Yeah, absolutely, caller. The caller says, Schalk, I'm sorry, caller, but the way we have to do this show means that sometimes your voice is not heard by Schalk. Schalk, what the caller is saying, the government was not created for the smaller guy, and this is happening worldwide. So it's kind of why are we expecting the government to step in and help us when it wasn't created to do that? There's a small handful of elites that thrive, and the rest of us are just going to fall by the wayside.
Karin, I like your caller. I like him very much. I want to come and visit him and drink coffee with him. I agree with him 100%. I'm a conservative at heart. I believe that the government must be as small as possible and as unintrusive as possible. With that, I agree 100%. And it's a worldwide trend. And here's the thing. South Africa is 2 generations in front of the US, and it's 2 generations in front of the world. What you're seeing in South Africa today is your future. I'm promising you that. If the world does not wake up to what it's actually at this point doing, you're going to end up at exactly the same point as South Africa. You are seeing the future being played out in South Africa.
Yeah, you are, and that's what I've been trying to say for the last year to Americans and to the rest of the world, that you need to be watching South Africa. You need to have a close eye on South Africa because it's coming, and now it's not even just coming. It's there, and because they were not watching South Africa, they did not put in place things to prevent it happening in their own country, and now they're sitting with it.
Karin, a simple thing in the United States, your deficit. Under the Obama government, your deficit skyrocketed. How are you going to pay back your deficit? It's impossible. You're going to get to a point where you can't pay the interest on your deficit. Literally, and you had shutdowns of government. I can remember, I can recall in the last few years, maybe twice, that government in the US had to shut down because there's no money.
Yep.
Now the Republicans were blamed for that. It was said, yeah, but they're playing a political game. I don't believe that they were playing a political game. The deficit in the US. That's indicating to you you're going the exact same route as South Africa is already at.
Absolutely. Schalk, we have 2 minutes left. So if you have some thoughts to wrap up the show, I'd be very grateful.
Thank you, Karin. No, it was a great privilege to be with you and your American listeners. Yes, I'm not a skeptic, and I'm simply being a realistic person. I'm not a racist. I'm not against black people. All I'm saying as a white South African, this is what's happening. It's a reality that we're living in. We can change it around, but that's mostly theoretical at this stage. From the outside world, we're going to need a lot of help very soon. Thank you, Karin.
Thank you very, very much, Schalk. This was an incredibly informative show. I'm sad to say that I agree with you on very many of the things that you say. I do not see a bright future for either black or white in South Africa because the dictatorship is coming. The government doesn't care about the man in the street, and literally that is where South Africans are right. Thank you very much, Schalk. God bless South Africa. God bless the USA.
Keep well, guys.
The world that we live in today. I'm playing out, as always, with the South African national anthem.